There we go. All right. Well, thank you to everyone for putting aside some of your time today to listen to my presentation. My thanks also to Adianto and Desi from the Petromindo team, and obviously all the sponsors for hosting the webinar this year. It was a great privilege to be able to participate. So I've been asked today to actually have a bit of a deep dive into the Philippines and to provide an overview of the situation that's happening there at the moment and look at the opportunities for future growth. I thought the best way, I'm sorry, I'm just going to move, sorry, the cameras are in my screen, so I will just start again. So I just wanted to start with an overview of the Philippines. What we can see is that the Philippines is currently the world's second largest nickel laterite miner, behind, obviously, as you know, Indonesia. Laterite ore is sourced from around 6 different mining provinces, and there are 2 well-established HPAL operations at Coral Bay and Taganito, which are operated by Sumitomo Mining. I thought the best way to maybe look at what is happening in the Philippines and just understand, you know, the issues that are there is to quickly do a quick SWOT analysis. So I wanted to look at the strengths. So what we believe is that, you know, it is the second largest nickel ore producer, and we obviously have the HPAL capacity. The Philippines is extremely close to other Asian customers and obviously has benefited greatly from exporting to China over the last, the last 10 years effectively. It has been a consistent exporter of nickel ore despite internal unrest, which has included, you know, changing environmental policy, but also some political unrest there as well. And this is what we would say would certainly be a weakness in terms of the country, that we see the political instability and the changes in environmental policy, but also there is some limited potential for downstream processing to a lack of other natural resources. So this is really in comparison to, say, what we see obviously in Indonesia with the development of MPI, and because of the volume of thermal coal that is existing in Indonesia, which obviously the country has been able to take great advantage of. In the Philippines, in contrast, this is not the case. So we don't have that you know, wealth of thermal coal, but also other raw materials that can, say, support a nickel pig iron industry, similarly to what has actually occurred in Indonesia. So the opportunities, if we're looking from a Filipino perspective, is potentially to expand intermediate MSP production, so the mixed sulfide precipitate production, to take advantage of the burgeoning EV demand, which is what our previous 2 speakers have actually pointed to and alluded to some of the Wood Mackenzie data. So the other options, we believe, for Filipino miners is they could expand their ore export volumes beyond China, potentially to other customers within region. The threats we believe for Filipino miners and producers is that China is needing less and less ore from Filipino miners as it imports increasing volumes of nickel pig iron and stainless steel from Indonesia. But what I will do is touch upon all of these points throughout the rest of my presentation. So if we look overall and we compare the Philippines to its peers in the industry, and we look at the nickel industry cost curve for 2021, which is shown here in the chart, we can see that Philippines on the left-hand side is in the first quartile, but it is a very small refined producer. So we were talking, as I said, about the MSP that it produces via its HPAL operations, which is sent for processing in Nahama and Harima at Sumitomo's refineries. You can see in terms of its position, Indonesia and China are really clearly taking up the bulk of the cost curve for nickel these days. And what you can also see is that at current prices of around $16,000 per tonne nickel or $7.30 per pound nickel, everyone at a C1 level, or most of the cost curve, is making actually decent margin at this level. If I move on, just talking about the Philippine nickel ore shipments to China, and as I said in the first slide, they've been very consistent since 2014 when the Indonesian export ban first came into place. What you can see here in the chart is in the light blue bars, we are showing the Indonesian export volumes. So we can see up until January 2014, when the first export ban ended, how the Philippines material steadily progressed into China. And then we can also see with the start of this exports again from Indonesia, in 2017 up until basically January last year, also displaced some of the Filipino material. But in 2020, we believe that the Filipinos basically exported around 390 kilotons to China, which was actually quite a bumper year for the country. So this is a similar chart to what I showed before, but we can really see the cyclic nature of exports to China from the Philippines on the left-hand side chart. So over from a monthly perspective, and we can really see, basically January, February, and March very much highlight the monsoon season, so that there's very little or much less exports during those months as opposed to the remainder of the year. Nickel ore shipments are dominated by production from the Surigao province in the Philippines, but the Tawi-Tawi region and the Palawan provinces are also large exporters, with all three provinces actually accounting for around 75% of total shipments in 2020. What we do believe about the Tawi-Tawi region is that while there was quite a ramp up last year from production there, or much of the ore has now been exploited. So we would expect to see less volume coming from Tawi-Tawi in 2021. We can look to see that the Filipino miners have actually really benefited from Chinese ore prices during 2020 and earlier this year. Nickel ore prices in China increased by around 62% since the start of April last year, and are still around 46% higher than they were in April. This is really somewhat attributed to the recovery in China post the COVID lockdown finishing around the April the 7th in the Wuhan province, and also can be attributed to stimulus of around US 500 billion, which was injected into the Chinese economy, so really supporting demand growth. And from a wider perspective, we can really see that has driven global demand post-pandemic and post-lockdowns, and is really attributed to positive demand growth actually for 2020, but very significant demand growth this year in 2021. On the right-hand side, we can just see that Filipino ore production, our expectations over the next 5 years, from 2020 being somewhat of a peak year for production, we see that the ore available for export we expect to fall, as I mentioned before, in part due to the Tawi-Tawi reduction in mining from that province, but also because of the requirement of China and basically the country not needing as much for its NPI production. And this has simply been the idea that, production in Indonesia has displaced or been positioned in Indonesia as opposed to it being in China anymore. So what we see is that China is actually becoming increasingly self-sufficient in nickel with, of course, Indonesia's help. More and more NPI is sourced from Indonesia, and it means that Chinese NPI output will fall, which is what you can see here in the chart in the dark blue bars. Meaning that there'll be less dependence on nickel ore imports from the Philippines, as I've been discussing. But in addition to this, Chinese producers will need less class 1 nickel for their stainless production, and they'll require less ferronickel in the future, simply because, as I said before, everything is happening in Indonesia now at these big industrial parks at Morowali and Sulawesi, and obviously Weda Bay is emerging as well. And China is now taking or importing that material back for use in its cold rolling mills. So just to really press home the point, we can see that Indonesia actually eclipsed China as the world's largest NPI producer in 2020. After producing since 2015, Indonesia is now going to account for around 54% of global class 2 nickel, so NPI or ferronickel product in 2021. And this will easily offset the decline in Chinese nickel pig iron. You can see on the right-hand side the impact in relation to the Philippines, how ore production did drop in the 2014-2017 period in Indonesia, but as new smelters have been built, and as I mentioned before, the industrial parks at IMIP and Weda Bay have escalated in size. That ore that used to be shipped in competition with Filipino ore to China is now being consumed in-house in Indonesia in its own furnaces to produce stainless steel and nickel pig iron. And this really, I think I'm talking to the converted here, but obviously this is the ramp up that we've seen, which is absolutely remarkable, from a position in 2016 of having less than 200 or around 100 kilotons of nickel in MPI output, up to what we expect will be 1.2 million tons of nickel in MPI coming out of Indonesia only next year in 2022. So for countries such as the Philippines, we do think, and obviously Indonesia as well, the demand for nickel sulfate in battery, Asia is a dominant player. The electric revolution is driving up demand for battery materials like nickel sulfate, and we really see that Asia, and in particular Chinese dominance in this segment, will continue. So what we can see from the chart is the uptake that we're expecting, and the red area simply shows Asia unspecified uptake there for nickel in precursors for EV and ESS over the next period, basically from 2021 through to 2030. So we are expecting by 2030 that battery precursors will account for around 20% of global nickel demand, increasing to around 37% by 2040. So as some of the other speakers have actually alluded to, that growth in demand is certainly accelerating from the battery sector. Countries like the Philippines can potentially take advantage of that through expanding their MSP production and creating more value-added products that can tap into this demand as EVs take off around the world. And just to sum up in terms of what we are looking at in terms of supply and demand, we really see that this is a shorter term view than the previous two speakers showed, but up until 2030, we still believe that we have enough nickel supply at this stage in order to meet our projections for demand. However, by 2027, a gap will start to emerge, and by around 2029, there will be a need for nickel from new projects in order to meet, the acceleration that we expect from EV batteries from 2028 onwards. And on top of that, we expect that a nickel price of around $8 per pound real will be the thing that encourages investment in projects to produce new supply beyond that date. But as I said, the market, we do not expect will need new projects until at least 2029. So I realize I've gone through that quite quickly, but I understand that we are somewhat over time now. So I perhaps leave you to look at my key takeaways in your own time, and we might go back to the organisers or to Ben so that we can have some Q&A.